Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives and those of our children. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I want to remind you, as I often do, about Charlie Fabian, a volunteer who takes suggestions and comments that you may have that will help us design future programs. You can reach him at charlie.info438@gmail.com. I also want to tell you that we have now released our new book. I finished it a few months ago, and it is now ready for you if you're interested. It's available both in paperback and ebook versions, and you can go to our website, democracyatwork.info, and order it. It's called Understanding Capitalism. It really is the fruit of many years of my work as a teacher, as an activist. It's designed to give you a critical approach, but one that really gets to the heart of many of the problems, many of the myths, many of the confusions around this economic system, which is becoming the focal point of more and more social criticism and social activism. Once again, it's called Understanding Capitalism. I'm also going to talk today about a number of things: anti-nuclear war activity in the country, the changing attitude of Americans and people around the world towards having children. Economic implications are enormous. I want to give you an example of fraudulent government behavior. This time the example will come from England, but it has perfect parallels here in the United States and beyond. And then a remarkable Supreme Court of Ohio decision, which tells you about how the law favors employers over employees in one of those little details which, if you add them up, define an entire system. In the second half, we will interview Tess Fraad-Wolff. She's been a guest on this program before, and she will be talking about the collapse of patriarchy and how that comes out of the economic system we're living in and then reacts back to transform it even further. So let's jump right in. My first update has to do with a labor organization, to wit, the Western Massachusetts Area Labor Federation. This is an organization that represents 50,000 workers across a bunch of counties in Western Massachusetts. They have been active supporting and promoting a national effort called Back from the Brink. It's in favor of nuclear disarmament. In other words, it is taking a stand against what has been going on in recent years and which promises to continue, which is saber rattling, except the saber is now a nuclear warhead, ending the deals that stopped that from happening for quite a while under the so-called Cold War and so forth. I want to say to you all, take a page from the Western Mass Area Labor Federation. They are joining 486 other organizations that have endorsed Back from the Brink, 77 municipalities, and 43 members of the U.S. Congress are behind this. And they're also urging other AFL-CIO bodies, they're one themselves, to show that the labor movement is also behind this and thereby give it that much more power to shape our future, indeed, to make sure we have one. Now I want to give you an idea about a change that is affecting everything. The statistic here is stunning. As of 2023, in a national survey, people under the age of 50 are now 47% responding by saying they are not likely to have children ever. That is up from 37% just in 2018. It is a dramatic transformation. We are not, as a society, having children anymore on a scale we have never seen before. What is going on? Well, there are many factors. I wish I had hours to go into this. I hope to bring on to the program people who can help us understand more about this. But here are two things that we know from the survey. One of the most important considerations for people is it's too expensive. In other words, young people, people below the age of 50, are deciding that to pursue a career, to have and to build a decent relationship with a spouse, a partner, you put it all together, there's not the money, there's not the time, you're busy making a living, the children become impossible as a burden. That doesn't deny the joy of children, it doesn't deny any of that, but it is a realistic assessment of what you can do. For yourself and for your children, an overstressed, overdamaged, unhappy life is no gift at all. I know I am speaking in the shadow of extraordinarily backward comments by Mr. Vance, but I had this program prepared before his name even came up. I want you also to see the context. Capitalism, as our economic system, either enables us to live well or it doesn't. If it denies people adequate income to have a good life and to bring up children, that's a problem of the system. You cannot blame the people who, living in this system, having to live with what this system provides, make the choices that they do. But now let's ask the question. If 47% of the people are not going to have children, you're not going to reproduce your own population. And these numbers are similar to numbers in many other countries in the world. It's almost as if capitalism is showing us yet another way in which it has run out of gas. It cannot sustain its own population. It has, whatever it gives people, it takes away from them the incentive, the wherewithal to be parents. And how are you going to then solve the problem? Because capitalism is a system that constantly expands. Every capitalist has to grow or else die. Well, here we go. And now you see the impact of this momentous transformation. Immigration in many parts of the world and in the United States has served as the alternative way to keep your population growing, to provide people to do the work. Usually, in the case of immigrants, the lowest paid, the worst drudgery goes to them. You cut off immigration because it has social consequences that shake the people up, and you're not going to be solving your population problem. Well, that raises an interesting question. Maybe the Republican Party's opposition to abortion has a much simpler explanation than all the references to religion and so on. Maybe there's a lot of support for the end of abortion because it's a way of getting your population to grow. Although, think about it. People who would have preferred an abortion, now denied one, have a child. How are they going to relate to that child? What kind of life are you giving that child if it is not wanted? Maybe an economist doesn't think about that, but an economist should. And maybe the last thing to think about in all of this is whether or not capitalism, understanding its own destructiveness, its own inability to give people what they need in order for the population to grow, is preparing itself to get through that crisis. Maybe that's what artificial intelligence taking away all those jobs is really about. We don't care about whether people have jobs, and we then don't have to care about whether we have people, because we're going to have AI do the work. Wow. Where capitalism is taking us is yet another reason why we ought to think critically about it. Hasn't its time come? Hasn't its time gone? In 2023, the Conservative government in England did something which will be familiar to those of you here in the United States. They decided that the country was suffering from, get ready, cancel culture. That is, right-wing extreme speakers were being shouted down. That is, polarization was taking place in people's thinking. And what they wanted to do was shut down everything left of center. So they invented, and I mean that, they invented the idea that free speech was in danger on British campuses. And they introduced a law allowing the government to get involved in what goes on in the university. It's the exact opposite of free speech. But they made a mistake. They commissioned a survey of British universities in which they asked thousands of students across the university landscape, do you feel your free speech is limited? Are you hesitant or uncomfortable about saying what you think? 90% said no. And now that the Conservatives were voted out of office overwhelmingly, and the Labour Party is now the government in Britain, one of their first acts, they've only been in power a few weeks, was to cancel that law that the Conservatives. There is no free speech crisis. There is no cancel culture other than in the right-wing mind and in the propaganda machine it operates. And a Labour government is not a conservative machine participant. They have their own machine. So that law will not go into effect. Notice, all the noise about cancel culture in Britain, barely 10% had any sympathy for it. Doesn't justify a law, but they used it, they tried, and that's exactly what they do in the United States. The last update we have time for is that bizarre decision of the Ohio Supreme Court. A restaurant offered boneless wings on its menu. A patron ordered it, ate those wings, and got extremely hurt from a bone that turned out to be in the boneless wing. Went to court, sued the restaurant. The courts all the way up to, including the Supreme Court of Ohio, decided in favor of the restaurant. The patron should have known that boneless wing is just a saying, just a word, has to do with how it's cooked. It is not a statement that there isn't a bone in the boneless wing. You know what that is? That's a decision to protect restaurant profits at the expense of the public's health and right to know. Remarkable. Favoring the employer over the employee. That's what the courts, especially now, do. We've come to the end of the first half. Stay with me. Our interview with Tess Fraad-Wolff will be coming up right away. Friends, I don't want to insult your intelligence. I know that you know that it costs money to produce these programs, to have the people working on the different aspects that lead us to deliver a show every week. Please help us if you can, for whatever amount you can. It's really easy. Go to our website, democracyatwork.info, and there you'll see the ways to donate. And likewise, go to Patreon, where Democracy at Work has a really fine audience that is supportive of us, and we ask you to consider joining them. Thank you. Welcome back, friends, to the second half of today's economic update. I am very happy and pleased to bring back to our microphones and our cameras Tess Fraad-Wolff. I do that in part because many of you have let us know how much you appreciated her other appearances on this program, and I know from talking to her that it meant as much to her as it did to me. And we want to serve, and this is a way for us to do it. Tess Fraad-Wolff is a practicing New York City psychotherapist and has been working with individuals and couples for over a decade. So before we begin, let me thank you for sharing your time with us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Okay, over the last several decades, enormous changes have swept across the American economy, as indeed across other countries' economies. Here in particular, automation, outsourced jobs, competition for jobs have changed the lives of millions of people. The economic conditions, particularly of men, have deteriorated, while those of women did much better. To sustain family incomes, women added paid work to their household labor if they hadn't already done so. They also took paid work as part of a long-term women's liberation from the isolation and drudgery of household labor, as well as from their economic dependence on men. Women now lead in choosing not to be married, not to have children, and not to accept traditional subordinations to men, what is often called patriarchy. You've spoken with us about that. There's enormous growing interest in it. So these are the questions I would like to pose to you as we think about and adjust to this reality. How would you characterize the way men have reacted, in a general way, to what I just described, to the deterioration of their economic conditions, opportunities, and so on?
I think that there's a crisis of notions of masculinity. You could say there's a crisis of masculinity. I think it's more about ideas about masculinity, where men don't know exactly where to place themselves any longer. Partly it's because of a negative self-identity, or what I would refer to as a negative self-identity, by which I mean you cannot define yourself to advantage with substance as not that. And I think men have been encouraged, not by their own fault, but by a misguided and destructive patriarchy, as not a woman. There's a lot less certainty about what is a man and what is masculinity than I don't want to be feminine, right? And whether that's the two sort of greatest schoolyard insults for children are to be called a woman or a girl. Even when you get older, past the schoolyard, this persists. Right? For men to be called a girl or a woman in all different ways we say it is absolutely humiliating, or to be referred to often in a bigoted fashion as a gay man. That is also hated because it is associated with the feminine. So I think that men have a sort of gap where esteem, confidence, self-vision, and notions of masculinity could live. This instills insecurity. I can't just be not him. They can't just be not her or not gay. They have to figure out what they are. And the older notions of masculinity, the provider, the protector, you could look at things like that, are no longer applicable in a capitalist labor market that doesn't care how much you adhere to patriarchy. It's going to need 2 salaries, if not more.
How would you differentiate the way the recent times and changes have impacted the women?
I mean, for women, I think there has been delightful access to many forbidden territories, whether that's trade school, higher education, whole industries that were extremely male dominated, that women have infiltrated, they've been allowed. There were enough feminine judges, enough feminine lawyers, enough feminine lawyers to create the Me Too movement of 2018, enough people, male allies as well. Those are crucial, who recognize that men and women are fundamentally equal and that it serves both of their interests, individually and as a collective society, to treat people more equitably. This is something else you and I talked about in a previous show, where I really want to get out the idea that supremacy is terrible for the supremacist. I don't mean that the supremacy doesn't serve privileges of the supremacist beings. Of course it does. I mean, overarchingly, it eats into the happiness and the quality of life of everybody. So that male supremacy or patriarchy, I view them as pretty similar, is terrible for men. And this is not discussed in society in a sort of paradoxical way, because I think that criticizing patriarchy has become feminine, and therefore often men seek to avoid it. I'm generalizing. There are exceptions. I'm glad for them. I hope they multiply.
All right, let me go right after this point. Given what you've said, how would you summarize, if that's the right word, the impact on relationships between men and women, in the sense that both of them having been affected in the ways you've just talked about, their relationship will have to be affected too. And I'll just mention the statistics everybody, I think, now is familiar with. The divorce rates that are sort of overwhelming, the huge number of people who live together with a partner but do not get married, whatever exactly that means, that choice. And now the most recent one that we talked about earlier in this program, 47% of people under the age of 50, 47%, half our people have no intention of having children. They don't want the children. And we talked about what's going on. How has this system rearranged itself to put men in this kind of difficulty, to give women the kinds of opportunities, and yet to put the relationship under what seems to be extraordinary stress?
I mean, the not having children is complicated. A lot of that has to do with the environmental decay from the billionaires polluting everything and the companies spewing, unspeakable toxicity into the water and air, so that resources are appearing more and more scarce. The planet's hotter and hotter. A lot of people feel eco-anxiety, as it's termed in my field, and that factors into not having children. I think the biggest thing is that children are so expensive, and as so much has become unaffordable, along with the deregulation and privatization of everything, having children is not affordable. In addition, women understand very well and very painfully in their bones the sacrifices involved in having children, more stereotypically, again, generally speaking, than men do, because women have been expected to and have performed the vast majority of child rearing and domestic care for a long time in most places in the globe. All of these things conspire to make people hesitate, prolong having children, or not have children at all. The marriage issue is a major issue because the woman was this subservient domestic party there. And I understand in exchange for her domestic care, child rearing, emotional labor, and such, in the former arrangement, she received economic protection, some degrees of physical protection, hopefully some solidarity from her male counterpart. It's just no longer applicable. Again, the capitalist labor market needs multiple salaries in order to barely function. It doesn't matter how patriarchal you are, unless you're rich, your wife is going to have to go to work. And that's going to create a different energy between people. Additionally, I don't think people, this is really basic and really fundamental, know how to work out relationships very well. That's not their fault. We don't teach psychology. I never understood why we don't teach some basic psychology in school the way we teach math and English in this country. Why wouldn't you teach a basic fundamental understanding of relationships? It would help you. It would probably lower the divorce rate, which is spiraling. And I think that people are very stressed out. Eco-anxiety, economic anxiety. We live in a sort of political hellstorm, even if things are a bit more hopeful these days than they've been in a moment. And it's very difficult to attend to the work necessary to upkeep a real bond.
I'm an economist, so bear with me if I ask you this question. When women in the millions who used to think of life as homemaker, mother, wife, all of that, now usually that's what it is, add to that function going out to work for for money in a paid job. Well, it's a wonderful thing for employers. They're getting an enormous increase in the number of people looking for work. That's wonderful for them. They can select among them. They can pick the most profitable. With all these people looking for work, the wages won't be going up. They'll probably be going down. I can see how this wave is a wonderful thing for the employer. But it seems to me for the employee, I get it that women are breaking out of a subordination of long standing. That makes sense. But they are also adding a whole new stressor to their lives. They're going to add paid employment where they're constantly at risk of losing their job or having the job conditions change on them. They have effectively little or no power in most cases over it. This must be a very difficult adjustment that women are going through, and therefore their families as well.
It is very difficult. I think it's very exploitable and exploited, as you say. I also think that women, again, I'm generally speaking, recognizing that there are exceptions, approach work differently in some regards than men do. There have been some studies on this. Women tend to be less demanding, both to feminine detriment and advantage. Everything is an advantage and a disadvantage, depending on how you look at it. So women typically, again, are less likely to self-advocate, less likely to to push for more money, to push for greater benefits. So that's the detriment. The advantage side is there's more humility, there's more willingness to work up the ranks. And for some of those reasons, I think women have broken into various educational and professional territories.
All right, this is a tough question in the 2 minutes that we have left. In your opinion, is the arrival on the scene of the first, well, I shouldn't say that. Is the arrival of Kamala Harris as now the likely presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, is this at the same time a reflection of the things you've said and the changes we've been analyzing? Is it a sign for change that's coming? How do you assess the rise of women to the very top levels of our political system, at least a few, and now, in a sense, culminating with Harris?
I think you're right on both counts. This is a vision of what is to come. This is a vision of what has come about. The majority in this country is not going to be white very shortly and is not male. And this is a very important representation. Identity politics are not everything. It is foolish to say that someone is great because they're a woman, because they're brown, because they're gay, because they're immigrant. That is foolish and reductive. And representation continues to matter. We have to hold simultaneous, multiple truths. So identity politics matters, and it doesn't matter above all. I'm not going to vote for Ann Coulter because she purports to be a woman. And I'm going to say that I am glad a woman is running for president. The symbolism is very important to me, and I think it's very important to everybody. Men, women, trans, everybody can look and see more representation. The greater the representation, the greater the sense of permission that we all feel. And I see hope in that. It's not the answer to everything. It's not a panacea. There are multiple critical angles to take fairly, and I celebrate it and see it as a hopeful sign.
You've ended us on time. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to be very interested to see whether this time as well, you generate with your thinking and your approach the kind of response you have in the past. Thank you very much again. And to all of my viewers and listeners, I look forward to speaking with you again next week.